All right, welcome to The Explainer. The Catholic Church has this list of popes, right? It stretches back almost 2,000 years, an unbroken line that's a cornerstone of Western history. But today we are diving into a really wild theory, one that claims this entire history was, well, invented.
You know, we're all taught to see this list as this solid, unbreakable chain going all the way back to St. Peter. But what if that chain isn't a record of the past, but a clever, almost architectural fabrication? What if it was designed, not something that just happened?
And just to be super clear, we're not talking about a few mixed-up dates or one or two disputed popes. The theory we're digging into today argues that whole centuries of the papal list were pretty much made up out of thin air.
So where does an idea this massive even come from? Before we can even look at the evidence, we first have to get our heads around the theory's starting point, the one belief that everything else is built on.
Okay, so this is the bedrock of the whole argument. It's like the first domino. The theory basically says, look, if you start from the position that the New Testament is a work of literary fiction, then it has to follow that the historical figures who come from it, like St. Peter and all his early successors, must also be fictional. It's a huge claim for sure, and you really have to grasp this one idea to see where all the other pieces of evidence come from.
Okay, so if the list was fabricated, how in the world would you even do it? Well, this theory suggests it wasn't random at all. It was systematic. The claim is that there's a kind of code behind it, a set of rules and patterns used to generate centuries of what they call fake history.
According to this theory, the whole process boils down to two main techniques. First, you've got what's basically a copy and paste job, just taking names and the lengths of their reigns from an older time and reusing them to create a new one. The second method is a bit more complex, more like an algorithm, creating new popes using these predictable, almost mathematical patterns.
Okay, so let's look at how this copying is supposed to have worked, because it's pretty interesting. It wasn't just a simple one-for-one duplicate. The idea is that the creators, or forgers, they used different source materials for different bits of data. As you can see here, they allegedly took the names from one specific period, but then borrowed the lengths of the reigns from a completely different century to stitch together a new artificial history.
And we're not just talking about a couple of coincidences here. The scale of this alleged copying is, well, it's huge. The theory claims that a full 50% of the papal names in this later period are either identical, very similar, or follow some kind of clear pattern from the era right before it. I mean, a number that high, it really makes you think, okay, is that just chance, or is there something else going on here?
So that's the how. But what about the actual proof? Now we're going to get into the really specific patterns and so-called clues that supporters of this theory point to as evidence of a massive, elaborate forgery.
This table, this is one of the most striking claims. It shows what's called a perfect symmetry in the timeline, spaced exactly 466 years apart. Just look, the first Germanic pope, Boniface II, is supposedly mirrored by the first German pope, Gregory V. The second Germanic pope is mirrored by the second German pope, and then check out the names, Silverius and Sylvester. The theory says, come on, that's not a coincidence. That's design.
Here's another one of these alleged historical echoes. We all know about the powerful popes from the Borgia and Medici families during the Renaissance. I mean, they're famous, they're definitely real. This theory claims they were essentially doubled, copied and pasted 500 years earlier into the timeline as the Counts of Tusculum, another super powerful family who just happened to produce a very similar string of popes.
Now for those algorithms we talked about. Just take a look at the papal numbering in this 100-year stretch. Does this look random to you? Out of the 11 popes who even had a number, a whopping 7 of them were the second. The argument here is that this isn't organic history unfolding. This is someone following a script.
And it doesn't stop there. This supposed pattern just keeps going right into the next century. As you can see, the focus shifts. All of a sudden, you get this cluster of popes who are the third, and then right after that, a cluster of popes who are the fourth. It's just a little too neat, right? Too clean for messy, real history. Proponents say the only popes that break the pattern are named Gregory, which suggests they were used as some kind of wild card in the formula.
So, okay, let's say for a second this is true. The implications? Man, they'd be enormous, and way bigger than just the papal list. This theory doesn't just call the line of popes into question, it ultimately rewrites the entire timeline of Christianity itself.
And you know, this idea of a younger Christianity isn't totally out of left field. This theory actually builds on the work of a historian, E. Johnson, who argued over 100 years ago that, hey, maybe early Christian texts, the Bible included, aren't ancient at all, but were actually created around the year 1500, or even later.
And to back up this idea of a much younger timeline, the theory points to this really, well, puzzling gap. The Latin Vulgate Bible was supposedly written around 400 AD,
but it wasn't actually declared the official binding text of the Church until the 1500s at the Council of Trent. The big question this theory asks is, why would there be an 1100-year gap with no single official version of Scripture?
And here's a quick, kind of curious side note. The source points out this little bit of wordplay. The guy who supposedly wrote the Holy Scripture, Hieronymus, well, his name in Greek literally translates to holy name. Coincidence? Maybe. But the author finds it just a little too perfect.
Okay, we've gone through the copies, the algorithms, the strange symmetries. Let's pull this all together and see where the theory ultimately lands and what it really asks us to think about. So if the list was fabricated, when does the real stuff actually start? This theory pinpoints a very specific moment, the year 1377, when the papacy finally returned to Rome from Avignon. It's only from this point on, the argument goes, that the papal list starts to look less artificial and more like real, messy, verifiable history.
So, to just recap the whole theory in a nutshell. First, you question a history that pretty much everyone accepts. Then, you present this copy and paste evidence. Next, you identify all these weirdly perfect patterns. And all of that leads to proposing this radically different, much younger timeline for the papacy.
And that leaves us with one last big thought. Look, whether you find this whole theory compelling or just completely out there, it really forces you to ask a pretty deep question about how we know what we know. If a history this foundational, this central to our world could be constructed, what else that we just accept as fact might be built on a similar blueprint? And that